It is Saturday, April the 6th, 2019. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, part 2 of the Proletarian poet, Pete Seeger. Yes, some concluding thoughts on the life and times and career of cultural, political, and musical legend Pete Seeger. Of course, before I get to all of that, just a brief reminder that today's show, like all these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant and become a recurring patron for as little as $1 a month to support the immense amount of time and research that I spend producing content for you. And thank you very, very, very much for your support. When we last left our hero, he had just shattered the ban on national television appearances with a performance on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. This ban was so severe that the ABC program Hootenanny, a program that was the direct result of the American folk music revival, would not host the nation's single largest contributor to that revival unless he signed a loyalty oath. 2 days after his 1967 performance of Big Muddy, Walter Cronkite called on President Johnson to withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam. Probably not a coincidence. In addition to visiting North Vietnam himself in 1972, Pete Seeger was a staple of the Vietnam Moratorium March, where he led a crowd of 500,000 people in the singing of the John Lennon song, Give Peace a Chance. But he never really abandoned his roots, singing for the labor struggle that is, including striking coal workers and radical steel worker in the 70s, but he will be branching out a bit. Now, beyond the sort of ephemeral effects that Pete had on the world's people, their minds and hearts, the songs they sing, culture, which I'll talk more about soon, there is one very tangible thing a person can point to and say, Pete accomplished this, and it's a good thing that he did. In 1966, the Hudson River, which Pete could see from his home base in his New York cabin, had seen better days. Now, to give you a bit of context, the Hudson River was once lined with factories, nearly all of which poured their industrial waste and garbage into the river legally. Waste that included human sewage discharges, heavy metals, pesticides, and other even nastier stuff. One company whose name you might be somewhat familiar with, who was involved a lot, was General Electric. One of the other companies, better known, that was involved was General Motors, and according to one ecologist, you could tell which color the General Motors factory's cars were painted that day just by looking at the color of the Hudson's water. Into this environment stepped the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater Incorporated Group, a non-profit environmental organization based for many years in Poughkeepsie, New York, and the brainchild of Pete Seeger. Pete had a somewhat naive, perhaps even stupid idea to improve the river situation, or at least some people at the time thought so. To hear Arlo Guthrie, son of Woody Guthrie, tell it, his idea went something like this. Pete's idea was to build a boat and sail it up and down the Hudson River while singing songs and attracting attention. While audiences began to show up, they'd see the ship, they'd hear the beautiful songs, and then they'd look down at the river, which is full of garbage and really sucks. And they will say to themselves, we've got to do something about this river. And everyone said, Pete, you're crazy. The river's too big, it's too expensive, ain't no one going to help you. And of course, all those people were wrong. Pete and Toshi started raising money for the boat in 1966, and by 1969, it was ready. To this day, you can still attend the Clearwater Festival in June of every year to celebrate nature and music in the Hudson River Valley. Though it would take decades for the river's quality to improve, it has improved. In 1972, partly as a result of Pete Seeger and his little sloop, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, requiring companies to obtain permits before just discharging shit into a river, among other requirements, which began to at least staunch the flow of toxic material into the Hudson. In 1984, 200 miles of the Hudson were designated as an EPA Superfund site, and in the years since then, hundreds of thousands of pounds of toxic sediment has been dredged up from the river, largely paid for by General Electric, by the way. You can now eat a little fish from some parts of the Hudson River, though not too much and not if you're a child, and you can swim in it too in places. In fact, if you do go out to enjoy the river, you actually need to watch out for whales now, in part because of Pete Seeger. The water quality there, though not what it was before humans started dumping garbage in it, has improved enough that humpback whales will often make their way upstream, especially during feeding season. Now, amazingly, General Electric has never stopped bitching about being put on the hook for dumping polychlorinated biphenyls into the Hudson, and they continue to complain about it long after Pete Seeger has strummed his last banjo string, which I personally interpret as Pete owning GE from beyond the grave. However, now getting into his 50s and 60s, you'll probably expect this to be the time for me to say something like, Pete began to slow down and mellow a bit. Well, he did begin to mellow a bit in his politics, if I'm being honest. The earnest, kumbaya singing activist who nearly always kept his edges nice and soft, kept them even softer as he aged, I think, though not without total edge. However, slow down? No, not really. Well into his 90s, he would be continuing to perform for causes and people he thought in the right. Poland's solidarity movement in the 80s was a favorite of his, despite his early alignment with Soviet communism. But when I say mellow a bit, I really do mean only a bit. In 1995, he said, quote, I still call myself a communist, because communism is no more what Russia made of it than Christianity is what the churches make of it, end quote, which seems pretty correct to me as a former pious Christian. In fact, in the 1990s, a little mini Red Scare against Pete Seeger cropped up just like the first one as he approached his twilight years. Such years are the prime time for an artist to be showered with awards and honors and namings and the like, and for such a popular and influential man of our world, he was no exception. But he would also deal with a lot of less talented and smart men than himself nipping at his heels over his former support of Soviet communism. Support I've already talked about the reasons for a little bit. The reasons Pete supported the communists, that they were anti-racist and pro-union, have only gotten better with time, while his opponents' grumblings about that support, essentially, but Stalin was bad, have only grown stupider, in my opinion. However, what about those honors? Well, there was a Harvard Arts Medal, which is better than the degree they give you when you pay them, I think, and more than one Grammy Award. Perhaps more impressive to you, Cuba awarded him the Felix Ferrer Medal in 1999, the highest award for cultural achievement the nation of Cuba bestows, and the awarding of which pissed off some of America's most pathetic and snarling reactionaries, which I think is awesome. Somewhat infamously, he was present backstage at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival when Bob Dylan sang a short set, famously backed by an electrified blues band. The sensational and definitely apocryphal story that went around and persists a bit today is that Pete, who had been an early backer of Dylan and pushed hard to get him record deals in a spot playing the festival, threatened to cut those cables with an axe as a reactionary folk music purist. Now, while he did say something of the sort, it was not a threat made in earnestness, though he did not care for Dylan's sound. Accounts of what happened during Dylan's poorly received set at the festival differed depending on who you'd like to believe, but the plainest way to put it is that Pete thought they sounded like shit, in large part because Dylan's lyrics could not be understood, and so did around half the audience. The other half seemed to like the sound, but were instead upset that Dylan's set was too short. And so between these two factions, who were both upset for mutually exclusive reasons, the set was poorly received. Or maybe it wasn't. Other people present contend that the crowd actually liked the sound and were only upset that they didn't get to play longer, but whatever the truth of the matter, what is certain is that Pete Seeger didn't like the way they sounded, and for Bob Dylan, This lukewarm response was like, quote, a dagger in his heart, end quote, and made him, quote, want to go out and get drunk, end quote. It is definitely true that Dylan's evolution as an artist did create a significant schism among his fans, with some of the anti-electric crowd not opposed to electric folk rock per se, just opposed to Bob Dylan sounding like shit on these particular electric devices. For my part, I will tell you what I think is personally one of the coolest achievements as a musician, if not a cultural icon, Pete Seeger ever got to, and that is his appearance at the 52nd Annual Monterey Jazz Festival in 1999. Now, the Monterey Jazz Festival was and is kind of a big fucking deal. Think of any jazz musician, performer, or composer whose name you can, if you can think of any at all. And they were almost certainly at Monterey at some point. John Coltrane, Dave Brubeck, Sonny Rollins, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Miles Davis, Buddy Rich, Wynton Marsalis, Billie Holiday, Ornette Coleman, on and on and on. Sometimes they came to revive their careers, sometimes they came to create their careers, but always, they all came to Monterey and continue to come today. Now, I'm going to let you in on a little secret about the jazz music world. Being a former jazz musician myself, while also being around classical music students, I can tell you that jazz musicians and fans are notoriously prickly and defensive about their art in a way that might be different than some other artists, I think. It's the result of a sort of siege mentality the jazz enthusiast develops when they're surrounded by people of the classical music world who often view their genre as a sort of afterthought to music education at best, or worse, a place for all the sloppier, less hard-working musicians to be funneled. In reaction, jazz enthusiasts often compensate by zealously defending the purity and credibility of jazz as a genre and an institution, and are often very careful about excluding music and musicians from their circle as insufficiently relatable to jazz. Well, I don't know how much complaining, if any, they did in 1999, but it wasn't enough to keep Pete off the stage. Now, the banjo is not a jazz instrument. Pete did not write or arrange jazz, but Pete was such a force in both American music, politics, and culture generally that, like only the most elite of musicians, he transcended music himself. As Larry Taylor described his appearance, quote, Saturday afternoons in Monterey are normally dedicated to the blues. Mostly true again this year, with John Scofield and the Piety Street Band beginning the day and blues vocalist guitarist Susan Takeshi finishing, but Pete Seeger in the middle really conquered the crowd with his band of 5 fiddlers and pluckers. The word legend is overused, but folk singer Seeger truly is one. He is enshrined for bringing folk music and grassroots activism to the fore in the 50s. At 90, Seeger is still tall, straight, and vigorous. His voice may not have the power of old, but his banjo picking and guitar playing seemed as good as ever. In charge of the group and reinforcing Seeger's vocal range was grandson Tal Rodriguez Seeger, a budding star himself. Along with baby boomers, the crowd was filled with former folkies and old hippies, as was apparent from the get-go, as most cheered and sang along with the opener Midnight Special. This was followed by a departure for Seeger, his rapturous rendition of Irving Berlin's Blue Skies. But no heart in the arena was left untugged during the final segment. First, Guantanamera, brought from Cuba to fame in the 50s, was given a hauntingly beautiful rendering with Tao reciting the humanistic lyrics of poet Jose Marti. Next, the finisher, This Land Is My Land. At its start, the crowd almost rushed the stage in delirious joy. Later, band member Ruth Unger Miranda confided that Seeger doesn't perform much anymore, much less fly from upstate New York where he lives. It seems Seeger was finally coming west for a family member's wedding, thus enabling festival general manager Tim Jackson to sign him up. One of Seeger's conditions was that he be scheduled to put on a children's concert. As a result, late Saturday afternoon, the Bill Berry stage was jammed with kids, grown-ups in the back. The house boisterously sang along as soon as Seeger and friends began with She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain, end quote. I can't stress enough to you how awesome this is, how important and talented and beloved you have to be to make it to the Monterey Jazz Festival stage, despite not being a jazz musician. Pete Seeger loved children, he loved nature, he fought for what he thought was right, but he was also one of the most important and admired musicians the United States of America has ever produced. In 2009, in what seems like a different world from 10 short years later, right? Pete Seeger played at Barack Obama's inauguration, where he hung out with the biggest stars in the world at the time. Beyonce, U2, Tom Hanks, Denzel Washington, these kinds of people. And in some ways, he was a poor fit. Not to disparage commercially successful musical artists and actors unnecessarily, this was just never Pete's path. To the extent he grew commercially successful, it was all kind of an accident. And his real fame, a product not of oodles of song sales, but of the people he touched in his life with his music. 2 years after that, he was in Columbus Circle with 1,000 souls hanging on his every word. At the age of 92, Seeger had grabbed 2 walking canes and walked 30 blocks through the prosperous Upper West Side of New York City, using Occupy Wall Street's signature mic check technique to teach or perhaps just remind the crowd of the simple words to his songs. His grandson, Tal Rodriguez Seeger, darted around the crowd playing for marchers and stepped to the words, "We're unstoppable, another world is possible," and beneath a banner reading, "Debt is slavery." Pete Seeger performed well into his 90s, and as much information as I've given you about the various causes and activists he supported in his over 70-year-long career, there is far, far more out there, I assure you. If I have spent what seems to be too much time on his politics in association with activists instead of his music, that's just because that's what Pete really cared about, who he brought together. As Arlo Guthrie put it, Pete Seeger had the #1 song in the nation in Goodnight Irene, and, quote, "I can't think of a single event in Pete's life that is probably less important to him," end quote. Pete Seeger sang a beautiful tenor, but there are actually billions of people on this planet, and no shortage of fine voices with excellent pitch and pleasing tone. But every person, if they are lucky, will get the opportunity to grow old, to lose their looks and talents and voices, and remain left with only everything else. The relationships they've nurtured, the personality they've developed, the wits they're able to keep. And what's amazing about Pete is that, frankly, his voice began to slack quite a bit as he aged, and he was no longer the truly masterful musician that he had once been. Even if the consummate performer Pete was somewhat paradoxically driven to downplay his own talent and importance to music at every opportunity. And you know what? It didn't matter at all. Because once Pete's voice left him, he was left with what was left. And what was left was a gigantic audience whose voices were really his now, who were happy to sing the words along with him. Every single moment, including this one right now, a tune by Pete Seeger is being hummed or sung or played. Before they hummed it or sang it or played it or whistled it, the tune lived inside their minds. And before the tune lived inside their minds, the tune lived inside Pete Seeger's mind, which I think is pretty amazing. Pete Seeger died a few months after his beloved Toshi on January 27th, 2014. He was 94 years old. Once, U.S. presidents had grumbled about him, sicked their dogs and law enforcement on him, blacklisted him from television and radio. Now they issued public statements about his beloved career and righteous conscience. He was the only person the organizers of the Woody Guthrie Award could think to possibly give the inaugural award to, and he remains the only person ever inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to be convicted of contempt of Congress, which one can either interpret as Pete finally winning over the mainstream, or the mainstream finally successfully co-opting Pete. I am genuinely unsure of which myself. Bruce Springsteen, the Dixie Chicks, and Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine. However different their music and personalities are from each other, all count Pete Seeger as an inspiration. Naturally, the humble Pete never wrote an autobiography, though a biography consisting in large part of his letters and quotations does exist that he contributed to, called How Can I Keep From Singing by David Dunaway, just for the record. He once told David, quote, songs won't save the planet, but then neither will books or speeches. You see, songs are sneaky things. They can slip across borders, proliferate in prisons, end quote. I mostly don't know what else to say myself about this guy, except that if you've never heard him before this, I hope you're glad you have now. Pete himself once said that the key to the future of the world is finding optimistic stories and letting them be known, and for my part, I think it's obvious that I believe he was right about that. However, before we close, I'll tell you a story. At Pete's 90th birthday celebration, Bruce Springsteen was extremely pleased to attend and said, among other things, the following words in tribute. Quote, and I asked him, Pete, how do you want to approach This Land Is Your Land? It would be near the end of the show, and all he said was, well, I know I want to sing all the verses. I want to sing all the ones that Woody wrote, especially the two that get left out, about private property in the relief office. And I thought, of course, that's what Pete's done his whole life. He sings all the verses, all the time, especially the ones that we'd like to leave out of our history as a people. At some point, Pete Seeger decided he'd be a walking, singing reminder of all of America's history. He'd be a living archive of America's music and conscience, a testament of the power of song and culture to nudge history along, to push American events towards more humane and justified ends. He would have the audacity and the courage to sing in the voice of the people. And despite Pete's somewhat benign, grandfatherly appearance, he is a creature of a stubborn, defiant, and nasty optimism. Inside him, he carries a steely toughness that belies that grandfatherly facade, and it won't let him take a step back from the things he believes in. At 90, he remains a stealth dagger through the hearts of our country's illusions about itself. Pete Seeger still sings all the verses, all the time. And he reminds us of our immense failures as well as shining a light towards our better angels and the horizon where the country we've imagined and hold dear, we hope, awaits us. On top of it, he never wears it on his sleeve. He has become comfortable and casual in this immense role. He's very funny and very eccentric. I'm going to bring Tommy out. And the song Tommy Morello and I are about to sing, I wrote in the mid-90s. And it started as a conversation I was having with myself. It was an attempt to regain my own moorings. Its last verse is the beautiful speech that Tom Joad whispers to his mother at the end of The Grapes of Wrath. It says, wherever there's a cop beating a guy, wherever a hungry newborn baby cries, wherever there's a fight against the blood and hatred in the air, look for me, Mom. I'll be there. Well, Pete has always been there. And for me, that speech is always aspirational. For Pete, it's simply been a way of life. The singer in my song is in search of the ghost of Tom Joad, the spirit who has the guts and toughness to carry forth, to fight and live for their ideals. And I'm happy to report that the very ghost of Tom Joad is with us in the flesh tonight. He'll be on this stage momentarily. He's going to look an awful lot like your granddad, who wears flannel shirts and funny hats. He's going to look like your granddad, if your granddad could kick your ass. This is for Pete. End quote. Thank you for joining me. This was for Pete. And for you. See you next time.
Well, now, you don't have to sing on this song if you don't want to. If you like the idea, though, you can help me out. If you love your Uncle Sam, bring him home. Bring him home. Support our boys in Vietnam. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. It'll make our generals sad, I know. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. They want to tangle with the foe. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. Here is their big fallacy. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. They don't have the right weaponry. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. The world's got hunger and ignorance. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. You can't beat that with bombs and guns. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. So if you love your local support our boys in Vietnam. Bring 'em home, bring 'em. Now I may be right, I may be wrong. Bring 'em home, bring 'em. But I got a right to sing this song. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. Now there's one thing I will confess. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. I'm not really a pacifist. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. If an army invaded this land of mine, bring 'em home, bring 'em home. You find me out on the firing line. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. Even if they drop their planes to bomb, bring 'em home, bring 'em home. Though they brought helicopters and napalm, bring 'em home, bring 'em home. So if you love your Uncle Sam, support our boys in Vietnam. Bring 'em home, bring 'em. Yes, show these generals their fallacy. Bring 'em home. They don't have the right weaponry. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. The world needs housing, food and schools. Bring 'em home, home, home. And learning a few universal rules.